It was the kind of night that seems to exist only in memory, thick fog curling along the lanes of the English countryside, the last lamps of a village flickering out one by one, and somewhere behind tall iron gates, a house that kept its curtains drawn even in daylight. Welcome, dear listener, to a tale of shadows and stubbornness, of a man who loved his possessions more than his own safety, and of the small, fastidious Belgian detective who alone understood why that love had gotten him killed. This is the story of Edmund Thorne, collector of things that belonged, by rights, to midnight, and of the night his collection outlived him. Some men collect for pleasure, others collect for power, and some, as Hercule Poirot would come to discover, collect because they are hiding something far more valuable than gold. Settle in then, pour something warm. The fog is rolling in, and Poirot has already noticed something you have not. Let us begin. An invitation to Ravenscombe. I have known Hercule Poirot for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time I have learned that when he receives a letter which makes him go quiet, truly quiet, not the theatrical silence he affects when he wishes an audience, it is worth paying attention. It was late October of that year, the kind of grey London afternoon that makes a man grateful for his own fireside, when I called upon him in his flat and found him standing by the window with an envelope in his hand, turning it over as though it might yield its secrets through touch alone. "Hayes, mon ami," he said, without turning. "You are punctual, as always. Come, read this, and tell me what you make of it." I took the letter. It was written in a cramped, urgent hand, the ink slightly smudged, as though the writer had sealed it before it was fully dry. "My dear Poirot, forgive the abruptness of this letter, but I find myself in need of your particular talents, and I do not trust the post to carry more than I have written here. I am being robbed, slowly, methodically, and I believe deliberately, of pieces from my collection. Small things, things a careless man might not notice missing. But I am not a careless man, and I have counted twice. I would not trouble you over mere theft, but I have begun to feel, these past weeks, that I am watched in my own house. I cannot say by whom, for everyone beneath this roof has been with me for years, and I would have staked my life on each of them. Perhaps I still must. Come to Ravenscombe Hall this Friday. Bring whoever you trust. I will explain everything when you arrive. More, I think, than I dare commit to paper. Yours, in some agitation, Edmund Thorne." I set the letter down. Well, he doesn't mince words, whoever he is. "Edmund Thorne," said Poirot, taking the letter back and smoothing it with 2 fingers, a habit he had with any piece of paper that offended his sense of order, "is a man I have met perhaps 3 times in my life, always at auction, always bidding against sense and reason for objects that no sensible man would want in his house." "What sort of objects?" "Ah!" Poirot's eyes brightened in the particular way they did when a subject pleased him. He is known, in the small and eccentric circle of collectors who know such things, as a man who collects only what he calls les objets de minuit, the midnight things, clocks that strike the wrong hour and were made to do so on purpose. Gemstones said to change color after dark. A chess set, I am told, carved from bone, which was reputedly used in a monastery to settle disputes that could not be settled by prayer. He does not collect for beauty, Hayes, he collects for story, for the shiver such things put into a man's spine. Sounds like an unpleasant sort of hobby. Sounds, Poirot corrected gently, like a man who is lonely and who has replaced the company of people with the company of objects that at least cannot disappoint him. He folded the letter and slipped it into his breast pocket. "We will go, of course. Pack for 2 nights, mon ami, and do not forget your revolver, though I very much suspect, that if trouble comes to Ravenscombe Hall, it will not announce itself so plainly as to require shooting." We arrived at Ravenscombe Hall the following Friday, as the last grey light was thinning into evening. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive, half swallowed by old yews that had clearly not been trimmed in a generation, and its windows, there were a great many of them, showed almost no light at all, save for a single glow on the ground floor. Cheerful, I muttered, as our taxi pulled away and left us standing before the great oak door. It is not a house built for cheer, Poirot agreed, tilting his head back to survey the facade with the frank curiosity of a man examining a puzzle box. It is a house built to keep things in, Hayes, or perhaps to keep things out. We shall see which. The door was opened before we had a chance to knock by a manservant of perhaps 60, thin as a rake, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life anticipating instructions before they are given. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hayes, you are expected. I am Jennings. He stepped back to admit us, and I confess the hall beyond took my breath rather more than I would like to admit. It was lined, floor to ceiling, with glass cases, clocks, small statuary, jeweled boxes, things I could not begin to name, each lit faintly from within by some hidden electric fitting, so that the whole hall seemed to glow with a low and watchful light, like a room full of sleeping eyes. Mr. Thorne is expecting you in the library, Jennings said, if you will follow me. We followed him down a corridor, equally lined with cases, past a suit of armor that Poirot paused to examine with unconcealed distaste. Rust, Hayes. Rust upon the pauldron. A man who cannot maintain his armor cannot be trusted to maintain his household. And were shown into a library where a fire burned low, and a man rose from a wing-backed chair to greet us. Edmund Thorne was not what I had expected. I had pictured, from the letter, a nervous and rabbity sort of man, but Thorne was tall, broad through the shoulder, with a full head of iron-grey hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent his youth somewhere considerably sunnier than England. Only his hands betrayed him. They moved constantly, straightening his cuffs, touching the arm of his chair, as though he could not quite bear to let them rest. Poirot, thank God. He crossed the room and shook my friend's hand with a grip that lasted a fraction too long. And this is Captain Arthur Hayes, a friend and colleague of many years' standing. You may speak as freely before him as before me. Good, good. Thorne gestured us to chairs and rang a small bell beside the fireplace. You'll want a drink after the drive. Jennings will bring something. Before the drink, said Poirot, settling into his chair with the particular precision of a small man determined not to be swallowed by upholstery designed for larger frames, I would like you to tell me, Monsieur Thorne, exactly what has gone missing and exactly who has had the opportunity to take it. Thorne's hands stilled, for the first time since we had entered the room. That, he said quietly, is rather the trouble. It could have been any of them, and I find, Poirot, that I am no longer certain I want to know which. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, a clock began to strike, slow, deep, and I noticed with a small unpleasant jolt, 3 strokes short of any hour I could account for. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Thorne, and did not blink. Then let us begin, he said, with the clocks. The collection and its keepers. Thorne led us himself through the ground floor of Ravenscombe Hall, and I will say this for the man. Whatever unease had gripped him in the library seemed to fall away the moment he stood among his possessions, replaced by something closer to tenderness. This, he said, pausing before a case near the center of the hall, is the Vesper clock, made in Lyon, 1740, by a clockmaker who was later hanged for heresy. It strikes 13 at midnight, once a year, on the anniversary of his death. I have sat up for it 3 times. I have never yet caught it in the act. A clock that keeps its own counsel, Poirot murmured, bending to examine the mechanism through the glass. How very discreet of it. And here, Thorne moved to a smaller case, softly lit, where a cluster of dark stones sat on black velvet. Star sapphires, Ceylon. Under moonlight, they show a 6-pointed star that vanishes entirely by day. Peasants there once believed such stones were fallen pieces of the night sky itself. Superstition, I said, but a beautiful one. All the best superstitions are beautiful, said Thorne, and for a moment there was real warmth in his face. That is why men have died for them. Poirot straightened. "You say that lightly, monsieur, but I think you do not mean it lightly at all." Thorne's warmth flickered out as quickly as it had come. "No," he admitted, "I don't." It was at this point that a young woman appeared at the far end of the hall, moving with the brisk, unhurried competence of someone entirely at home in the house. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, dressed with a plainness that seemed almost deliberate against the glittering cases around her. "Miss Verity Cole," Thorne said, "my secretary. She keeps the catalogue, and keeps me, more often than I'd like to admit, from making a fool of myself at auction." He said it fondly, but I noticed Miss Cole did not smile. "Mr. Thorne exaggerates my usefulness," she said, with a small, precise nod to Poirot. "I merely write down what he tells me to write down. Dinner is at 8, gentlemen, if you'd like to dress. Thank you, Verity." Thorne watched her go with an expression I could not quite place. Pride, perhaps, or something more complicated. "She has been with me 6 years, came to me half-starved from a bookshop that went under. I don't know what I'd do without her now." "She strikes me," said Poirot, "as a young woman who notices a great deal and says very little of it." "That's Verity," Thorne agreed, and did not seem to find the observation troubling. We met the rest of the household at dinner, in a room hung with tapestries so dark with age that the figures upon them had dissolved into mere suggestions of movement, glimpsed at the edge of the candlelight. Thorne's nephew, Roland Thorne, arrived last and loudest, a stout young man of perhaps 25, well-dressed in a manner that suggested more debt than income, who kissed his uncle's cheek with a theatrical warmth that did not quite reach his eyes. "Uncle Edmund." "And the famous Monsieur Poirot. Verity told me you'd sent for him. Should I be flattered or alarmed?" "That depends, monsieur," said Poirot pleasantly, "on how much you owe your uncle, and how eager you are that he should not learn the sum." There was a brief, brittle silence, and then Roland laughed, too loudly. "Well, straight to it then. I like a man who doesn't waste time on pleasantries." He took his seat with rather more force than necessary. Beside him sat a man introduced as Mr. Aloysius Grant, a dealer in antiquities whom Thorne had known, he explained, for nearly 20 years. Grant was soft-spoken, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life appraising things without appearing to look at them directly. "I've sold Edmund half of what's in that hall," Grant said, when Poirot asked the nature of his visit, "and tried, on more than one occasion, to buy back the pieces I regret parting with." "He never lets them go. I don't blame him. Some of what's in that collection oughtn't exist at all, by rights. It's a privilege merely to have handled it." "And yet," said Poirot, "you are here now, at his invitation, during a week in which he tells me items have gone missing from that very collection." Grant's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "Is that what this is about?" I wondered why the summons was so urgent. "You did not know." "I knew Edmund wanted my opinion on a piece he's considering. He said nothing of theft." Grant set down his fork with great care. "That is concerning." Last to be mentioned, though present throughout the meal in the manner of furniture one does not quite look at, was the housekeeper, Mrs. Agatha Price, a tall, spare woman who oversaw the serving of each course with the silent authority of someone who had run the house for longer than anyone else at the table had been alive. "Mrs. Price came to Ravenscombe with my father," Thorne explained, once she had withdrawn. "She has forgotten more about this house than the rest of us will ever know." "A formidable woman," Poirot observed. "The most formidable I know," said Thorne, with what sounded almost like fear beneath the fondness. It was later that night, as the household retired and the fire in the library burned down to embers, that Poirot and I sat alone with Thorne once more, and he finally told us what had gone missing. 3 pieces, he said, counting them off on his fingers with visible reluctance. A small mourning ring, jet and gold, said to have belonged to a woman who cursed her own husband from the grave. A page, only a single page, torn from a grimoire I acquired in Prague, of no great value, except that it completed the volume. And 3 nights ago, a silver bell that is supposed to ring of its own accord when death is near a house. Small things, Poirot said, echoing the letter. Things easily overlooked, easily pocketed, easily denied. Tell me, monsieur, who among your household had access to each of these pieces on the nights they disappeared? Thorne was quiet for a long moment, watching the embers. That is the difficulty, Poirot, he said at last. Every single one of them did. Verity has keys to every case in this house. Roland wanders these halls at all hours, drunk more often than not. Grant has handled half these objects with his own hands and knows their worth better than I do myself. And Mrs. Price? He stopped. And Mrs. Price? Poirot prompted, very gently. Mrs. Price, Thorne said, has never once, in 30 years, given me the smallest reason to distrust her, which is precisely why, God help me, I have begun to wonder if that is the most suspicious thing of all. Somewhere above us, a floorboard creaked, the particular, deliberate creak of a foot, placed carefully, as though its owner did not wish to be heard. Poirot's eyes moved slowly to the ceiling, and stayed there. Monsieur Thorne, he said quietly, I think, tonight, you had better lock your door. The silence after midnight. I did not sleep well that first night at Ravenscombe Hall, and I do not think I was alone in that. The room I had been given overlooked the east lawn, and twice I woke to what I could have sworn was a footstep in the corridor outside, soft and deliberate, pausing outside my door before moving on. Each time I rose and looked out, there was nothing, only the fog, thicker now, pressing against the glass like something that wanted in. I mentioned this to Poirot at breakfast, expecting him to dismiss it as the nerves of an old soldier unused to haunted houses. Instead, he set down his coffee cup with unusual precision. You are certain it paused outside your door, and not another's? Fairly certain? Why? Because, said Poirot, your room, I am told by Jennings, lies directly between the main staircase and Monsieur Thorne's own chamber. A person walking from one to the other would pass your door, yes, but a person merely walking the corridor for its own sake would not need to pause there at all. He dabbed his moustache with his napkin, a small, thoughtful gesture. It is a very small thing, Hayes. Possibly it means nothing whatsoever. I do not like small things that possibly mean nothing. They are, in my experience, the small things that mean a very great deal. We did not have long to wait for the small thing to become a large one. The second evening passed much as the first, a dinner strained beneath its own politeness, Roland drinking rather more than a man should who is trying to make a good impression, Grant quietly attentive, Miss Cole retreating early with the excuse of correspondence to finish, Mrs. Price moving through the room like a held breath. Thorne himself seemed distracted throughout the meal, glancing more than once toward the hall where his collection glowed faintly through the open doorway, and when the port was brought round, he excused himself earlier than courtesy strictly demanded. Forgive me. I want to check the Vesper case before I retire. Verity tells me the lock has been sticking. He rose, touched Poirot briefly on the shoulder, in a gesture that struck me, in hindsight, as almost apologetic, and left us. It was the last time any of us saw him alive. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning to a sound I could not immediately place, a high, thin ringing, like a bell struck once and allowed to fade, somewhere below us in the house. I lay still, telling myself it was nothing, that old houses make old house noises, until I heard a door open sharply down the corridor, and Poirot's voice, low and urgent, outside my own. Hayes, get up. Something is wrong. I have rarely dressed so quickly in my life. We found Jennings already on the stairs, candle in hand, his composure cracking for the first time since we had arrived. I heard it too, sir, from the hall. I don't like it, sir. We went down together, the 3 of us, and it was Poirot who reached the library door first, and stopped so abruptly that I very nearly walked into him. Edmund Thorne lay on the floor before the great glass case that housed the Vesper clock, one arm flung out toward it, as though even in death he had reached for the thing he loved best. The case itself stood open, its lock forced, and the small silver bell, the very bell Thorne had told us was missing 3 nights before, lay on the carpet beside his outstretched hand, as though it had been placed there, deliberately, for someone to find. There was a wound at his temple, dark and terrible in the candlelight, and beside him, fallen or discarded, lay a heavy iron clock key of old and ornate design. Poirot knelt beside the body with a swiftness that belied his earlier deliberateness, 2 fingers at Thorne's wrist, though it was plain, even to my unpracticed eye, that there was no pulse to be found. "He has been dead perhaps 20 minutes, Poirot said quietly. "No more. Hayes, wake the household. Gently, but quickly. No one is to leave their room until I have seen them. Jennings, you will telephone the police at once, and then you will stand at that door and permit no one to enter or leave this room, not even yourself, until I say otherwise." Jennings, to his credit, did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." I went up the stairs with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the climb. Roland Thorne answered his door tousled and reeking faintly of brandy, and went white when I told him, whether from shock or from something less innocent, I could not then have said. Miss Cole was already awake, fully dressed despite the hour, which struck me even then as curious, and received the news with a stillness that seemed less like control and more like a woman who had, on some level, been expecting it. Grant took longest to rouse, and when he came to the door, his eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from sleep or from weeping, I could not tell in the poor light. Only Mrs. Price's door, when I reached it, opened before I had even knocked, as though she too had been standing behind it, waiting. "He's dead, isn't he?" she said. "Not a question." "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Price." She closed her eyes for a moment, a single long moment, and then opened them again, dry and composed. "I'll dress and come down directly, Captain Hayes. There will be things to see to." I found this response, at the time, admirably practical. It was only later that Poirot pointed out to me how very strange it is for a woman to ask nothing, not how, not where, not who, before turning immediately to the question of duties to be performed. When the household had gathered, shivering and disbelieving, in the drawing-room, Poirot stood before the cold hearth and regarded them all with an expression I had come to know well over the years, mild, almost gentle, and entirely without mercy. "Mesdames, Monsieur, I am sorry to keep you from your beds at such an hour, and sorrier still for the reason. Monsieur Thorne is dead, struck down before his own collection, and I do not believe, from what I have seen, that this was the work of any stranger from beyond these walls." He paused, letting the words settle. The doors were locked. The grounds are watched by no fewer than 2 dogs who did not bark, and the wound upon his head was struck, I think, by someone he did not fear enough to cry out against. Roland made a small, strangled sound. Grant said nothing at all. Miss Cole's hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Price stood as still as the tapestried figures in the dining hall, watching Poirot with an expression I could not read. "Someone in this house," Poirot went on, "killed Edmund Thorne tonight, beside the very case from which a stolen bell had vanished 3 nights past, and returned it, it seems, only to leave it beside his body. That is not the act of a thief, interrupted mes amis. That is the act of someone who wished a message to be understood." His gaze moved, slowly and without hurry, from face to face. "I intend to understand it. I would advise each of you, most sincerely, to help me do so, for I promise you, whoever among you keeps their silence longest will find that silence serves them worst of all." Outside, through the tall windows, the fog had thickened until nothing at all could be seen of the grounds beyond, as though the house itself and all its secrets had drawn the night in close around it, and meant to keep them there. What the room remembered! The local police arrived a little before dawn, in the person of Inspector Bramwell, a heavy-set, unhurried man who struck me at once as competent, if not especially imaginative, the sort of policeman who trusts a locked door and distrusts a clever theory in equal measure. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," Poirot greeted him, with the particular courtesy he reserved for policemen he intended to outmaneuver. I am delighted you have arrived so promptly. I have, I confess, taken certain small liberties in preserving the scene, but I have touched nothing that your own men will not wish to see undisturbed." Bramwell regarded him with the flat suspicion of a man who has read of famous detectives in the newspapers and does not much care for the type in person. "You'll forgive me, sir, if I conduct my own investigation before I go crediting anyone else's small liberties. Naturally. I would expect nothing less. I merely offer what I have observed, for whatever small use it may be to you." Poirot's smile did not waver, though I caught the faint glint in his eye that told me he considered the inspector's pride a small obstacle, easily managed, and not one worth resenting. We returned to the library together, and in the grey light of early morning, the scene was, if anything, worse than it had appeared by candle. Thorne's body had not yet been moved. The wound at his temple was plainly the work of something heavy and hard-edged. The iron clock key, Poirot confirmed after a moment's close examination, bore a faint dark stain along one edge that would need no great skill to match to the wound. "The key was kept where, precisely?" Poirot asked, straightening. "In a drawer of that desk," said Jennings, who stood pale but steady by the door. "Mr. Thorne kept it there for winding the Vesper clock himself. He trusted no one else to do it. So the key was accessible to anyone who knew the drawer. And the desk stands." Poirot paced the short distance and back, counting under his breath, "perhaps 4 paces from where the body lies. A person startled, or angered, in this room need not have come armed. The room itself provided the weapon." "Meaning it wasn't planned," I said. "Meaning," Poirot corrected, "that it was not planned as a killing, Hayes. It does not mean the encounter itself was unplanned. A person may come to a room intending only to confront, or to search, or to threaten, and leave it a murderer without ever having imagined they would." Bramwell, crouched by the body, glanced up. "You're saying this was a quarrel gone wrong, not a cold-blooded job." "I am saying it is possible, Monsieur l'Inspecteur." "I do not yet say it is certain." Poirot's eyes moved to the open case, the small silver bell lying where it had fallen. "This troubles me more than the wound. The bell was stolen 3 nights ago. Tonight it reappears, beside the body of the man from whom it was stolen. Why return a thing one has taken, only to leave it beside a corpse? Guilt?" Bramwell offered. "Perhaps. Or a message. Or—" Poirot paused, and I saw the particular stillness come over him that meant a thought had caught, somewhere in the machinery of that remarkable mind, and not yet fully surfaced. "Or the bell was never truly stolen for its value at all, but for another purpose entirely, and its return tonight completes that purpose rather than confesses to it." He shook his head slightly, as though setting the thought aside for later examination. "I do not know yet. I dislike very much not knowing, Hayes, as you are aware." We spent the better part of that morning in the small study Thorne had used for correspondence, where Poirot conducted what he insisted on calling conversations, and Bramwell, with visible reluctance, called interviews, and permitted to happen largely because Poirot had a way of asking questions that made refusal seem like an admission in itself. Roland Thorne came first, hollow-eyed and considerably less jovial than he had been at dinner 2 nights before. "I didn't kill him," he said, before anyone had asked. "I know how it looks. I owe him money. Everyone knows I owe him money. But I didn't." "How much money, precisely?" Poirot asked, mild as milk. Roland's jaw worked. £4,000, perhaps a little more. A considerable sum for a young man to owe his uncle. "He was going to forgive it," Roland burst out. "He told me so, last month. Said he was tired of the debt hanging between us. Said he'd tear up the note on my birthday. I had no reason to want him dead, don't you see? I had every reason to want him alive. And can anyone confirm this generous intention of his?" Roland's face fell. "Verity might know. He told her everything eventually. But I don't have it in writing, if that's what you mean. Where were you last night, between the hour of 1 and 2:30? "In my room." "Asleep? Alone?" He said the last word with a bitterness that suggested he understood exactly how little it was worth as an alibi. When he had gone, Poirot sat a moment in silence, tapping one finger against the desk. A young man who drinks too much, owes too much, and offers an alibi that no one on earth can confirm. It is almost too convenient a portrait of guilt, Hayes. I find myself suspicious of suspects who arrange themselves so neatly into the shape of the obvious answer. You think he's innocent? I think, said Poirot, that I do not yet think anything at all, and that is precisely as it should be, at this stage. Let us see what Monsieur Grant has to tell us. Aloysius Grant, when he came in, sat with the composed stillness of a man accustomed to negotiations, though his hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. I've known Edmund 20 years, he said, before Poirot could ask. I sold him half his collection. I've no reason on earth to want him dead. A dead collector is a dead client, Monsieur Poirot, and I am, above all things, a businessman. And yet, Poirot said gently, you did not know, until I told you, that pieces had gone missing from his collection. A man who has sold Monsieur Thorne half his treasures might reasonably be expected to know their comings and goings rather better than most. Something flickered behind Grant's eyes, there and gone. I knew nothing of any theft. I give you my word. Your word, Poirot repeated, with no particular inflection, and let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable before moving on. Tell me, monsieur, the silver bell, you are familiar with it? I sold it to him myself. 2 years past. A curious piece. German work, I believe. 17th century, though the provenance is murky. Edmund was fonder of it than almost anything else in the collection. He used to say it was the only object in the house that told the truth. An interesting turn of phrase, said Poirot softly. Did he say why? Grant hesitated. The first true hesitation I had seen from him. He never explained it fully. Only that the bell, he said, could not be bribed, could not be flattered, and rang for no man's convenience. I always took it for one of his fancies. Now I wonder. He was permitted to go, and Poirot sat a long while afterward, turning that phrase over, as though it were a stone he suspected might have a second face. Could not be bribed, he murmured. Now why, Hayes, should a silver bell require such a virtue? I confessed I had no idea. Poirot, for once, did not pretend otherwise either, but I saw in his eyes that the question had already begun, quietly and without his permission, to answer itself. The weight of old secrets. Miss Verity Cole entered the study with the composed efficiency of a woman determined not to weep in front of strangers, and sat with her hands folded so precisely in her lap that I suspected the precision itself was an effort of will. You knew Monsieur Thorne's affairs better than anyone in this house, Poirot began, gently enough. His correspondence, his accounts, his private thoughts, perhaps, as much as a secretary is permitted to know them. I would ask you, mademoiselle, to tell me what he has been occupied with these past weeks, beyond the ordinary business of his collection. Miss Cole was quiet a moment. He'd been going through old estate papers, his father's papers, mostly, diaries, household accounts, that sort of thing, going back 30 years or more. He didn't tell me why, exactly, only that he'd found something in one of the pieces he'd acquired that made him want to check certain dates against the old records. Which piece? The grimoire. The one with the missing page. She hesitated. He was very odd about it, Monsieur Poirot, excited almost, but frightened too, in a way I hadn't seen from him before. He asked me, about a fortnight ago, whether Mrs. Price had ever spoken to me of the night his father died. Poirot's stillness sharpened into something more attentive. And had she? Never. Not once, in 6 years. I asked her myself, once, out of simple curiosity, and she told me it was a sad business, best left buried with him. I didn't press. One doesn't, with Mrs. Price. What manner of man was Monsieur Thorne's father? I never knew him. He died long before I came here. But the servants who remember him don't speak of him kindly, when they speak of him at all. There were stories, she lowered her voice, though there was no one to overhear, that he was a hard man. Harder to his wife than a gentleman ought to be. He died very suddenly, I'm told. A seizure of the heart, the doctors said, though he was not an old man, nor a sickly one. And Monsieur Thorne's mother died some years after. Of grief, people say, though I've always thought that a kind word for something sadder. Miss Cole's composure cracked, very slightly, for the first time. Edmund adored her. I think whatever he found in those old papers, it had something to do with her. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, Monsieur Poirot, but he spoke of her differently than he spoke of anything else in this house, and he owned a great many treasures. Poirot let the silence rest a moment before asking, very quietly, "And you, mademoiselle, did you love him?" I expected her to bristle. Instead, she looked at her hands and answered with a simplicity that struck me as entirely without artifice. I don't know that I'd have called it love. I'd have called it devotion, perhaps. He was the first person who ever trusted me with anything of consequence. I would not have hurt him for the entire contents of that hall, and I think you will find, when you look, that I have no earthly reason to have wanted him dead. He was going to leave me a legacy in his will. Ask his solicitor, if you don't believe me. A dead employer profits me nothing, Monsieur Poirot. A living one, grateful and generous, profits me a great deal. It was, I thought, a coldly practical thing to say of a man she had just called devotion-worthy, and yet I found I believed her rather more for the coldness of it than I would have for tears. Mrs. Price, when at last she was shown in, sat with her back very straight and her eyes very steady, and answered every question Poirot put to her, with the economy of a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much truth the situation required, and no more. You were housekeeper here under Monsieur Thorne's father as well as under Monsieur Thorne himself. I was. Tell me of the night the elder Monsieur Thorne died. Something crossed her face. So brief, I could not have sworn to it, had Poirot not remarked on it to me afterward. A seizure of the heart, sir. He'd had trouble with his heart for some years. It was not unexpected, to those of us who knew him well, and yet I am told he was not, by report, an old or sickly man. Sickness does not always show itself to strangers, Monsieur Poirot. Her voice did not rise, did not waver, nor even to family. Monsieur Thorne, the son, had been asking after that night, reading old papers, comparing dates. Do you know why? I could not say. Could not, madame, or would not. For the first time, something like real feeling moved behind her composed features. Not fear, I thought, but something closer to a very old grief, worn smooth by long handling. Monsieur Poirot, I buried that man's father, and I helped raise that man from the age of 9, when his mother had scarcely the strength to raise herself from her bed. I have given this family 30 years of my life. I would ask that you not mistake my silence for guilt. Some things are silent because they are sacred, not because they are shameful. And yet, Poirot said, with the particular gentleness he reserved for witnesses, he suspected of concealing something they believed, sincerely, to be a kindness rather than a crime. It is very often the sacred silences, madame, that guard the deepest wounds. I do not accuse you. I ask only that you consider, before this is finished, whether a silence kept too long has not, perhaps, done more harm than the truth it was meant to protect. Mrs. Price said nothing further, and was permitted to leave, and it was only after the door had closed behind her that Poirot let out a long breath and turned to me with an expression I had rarely seen him wear, not the bright satisfaction of a man closing in on an answer, but something more troubled. Hayes, he said, I begin to fear that this murder was not born 3 nights ago, nor even 3 weeks ago, when the first small object went missing from that hall. I begin to fear it was born 30 years ago, in a room we have not yet found, over a death none of us were alive to witness, and that Edmund Thorne, in his passion for collecting the world's small mysteries, at last collected one mystery too close to home. He rose and crossed to the window, where the fog still pressed grey and patient against the glass. A collection, he said quietly, almost to himself, is only ever a museum of the things a man cannot bear to let go of. I wonder, Hayes, whether that is true of houses also, and of the people who keep them. A conclusion too quickly reached. By that afternoon, Poirot had assembled, in his mind at least, an edifice of reasoning that he was plainly eager to test aloud. A habit of his I had long ago learned to indulge, for it was often in the act of speaking a theory that he discovered its cracks. "Consider, Hayes," he said, pacing the length of the study with his hands clasped behind him. "What we now know. Monsieur Thorne begins, some weeks past, to investigate the circumstances of his father's death, a death that occurred 30 years ago, and which the household, by long and careful habit, does not discuss. He grows agitated, he grows secretive, and it is at precisely this time that small objects begin to vanish from his collection, objects of no great monetary value, but of considerable symbolic weight, a mourning ring, a page from a book of dark lore, a bell that, we are told, cannot be bribed. You think someone was trying to frighten him off the investigation? I think," Poirot said, "that someone with knowledge of the old family history recognized what Monsieur Thorne was searching for, and understood that if he found it, they stood to lose a great deal. And who, among this household, has spent 30 years occupying a position from which old secrets might be observed and old silences might be profitably maintained? I saw where he was leading, and did not much care for it. Grant, Monsieur Grant," Poirot agreed, "who has known this family 20 years. Who sold Thorne the very bell in question, and who described it, in words I confess I have not been able to set aside, as an object that could not be bribed. An odd phrase, Hayes, unless the speaker's mind runs naturally to the subject of bribery. Who hesitated when I asked him of the theft, in a manner he did not trouble to hesitate over any other question? And who, we must not forget, stands to gain considerably should Monsieur Thorne's death throw the disposition of that collection into confusion, a confusion in which a trusted dealer of 20 years' acquaintance might find himself very well placed indeed." "It fits," I admitted. "It fits," Poirot repeated, with something almost like satisfaction, "rather too well, and I confess, mon ami, that after 5 days in this house of shadows and silver bells, I find myself impatient to see it fit into place at last." He straightened his waistcoat with a small, decisive gesture. "I will speak to Inspector Bramwell. I believe it is time Monsieur Grant explained himself rather more fully than he has thus far chosen to do. I record this moment with some reluctance, for it does no particular credit to my friend's usual caution, but I set it down honestly, because I believe he would wish it set down honestly." Hercule Poirot, for all his genius, was not immune to the particular seduction of a theory that arrives dressed in the clothes of elegance. He had built, from true observations, a structure that satisfied the eye and offended nothing in logic, and he had, for perhaps the only time in the whole of that strange affair, mistaken elegance for proof. Grant was summoned again to the study, and this time Bramwell attended in person, standing near the door with the particular watchfulness of a policeman who has begun to sense that an arrest may shortly be wanted. "Monsieur Grant," Poirot began, without preamble, "I believe you knew a great deal more of the elder Monsieur Thorne's death than you have told us. I believe Edmund Thorne's recent inquiries into that old history threatened something you valued a great deal, perhaps your standing with this family, perhaps something more concrete, and I believe the theft of these 3 objects, and the confrontation that followed, were your doing." Grant went very pale, and for a moment, I confess I believed we had our man. He stopped, started again. "I will not deny that I knew things about the old man's death that I have never spoken of, but not for the reasons you suppose." "Then for what reason, monsieur?" Grant's hands, which had been steady throughout every previous interview, now trembled visibly. "Because the elder Thorne did not die of a seizure, Monsieur Poirot. I have known that for 30 years, and I have said nothing, because the woman who told me begged me, on her deathbed, never to speak of it, and because the truth would have destroyed the only kindness that came out of that whole ugly business." "What woman?" "Edmund's mother," Grant said, very quietly. "She came to me some months before she died, and told me—" He stopped himself, visibly, with an effort that seemed to cost him something physical. "I will not say more. Not until I have thought carefully on whether it can be said at all without doing harm to people who are already dead and cannot defend themselves." Poirot's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the particular sharpened attention of a man who senses that his elegant structure has just developed its first crack, though he did not yet, I think, recognize it as such. "Monsieur Grant, a man is dead. Your discretion, however well-intentioned, may be shielding a murderer." "Or," Grant said, with sudden and surprising steel, "it may be shielding nothing but an old woman's grief, and I will not trade that for your convenience, Monsieur Poirot, however clever you believe yourself to be." Bramwell, at this juncture, stepped forward with the air of a man who had heard quite enough evasion for one afternoon. "I think, sir, we'd best continue this conversation at the station, where Mr. Grant might find his memory sharpens considerably." I watched Poirot for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of the caution I had come to expect from him, and for once I did not see it. He nodded, once, and said nothing to stop the inspector's men from escorting Grant from the room. It was only that evening, as we sat alone once more before the library fire, the same fire, I could not help but notice, before which Thorne himself had died, that I saw the first true doubt cross my friend's face. "Hayes," he said slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands without drinking from it, "tell me something. When Grant spoke just now of the elder Thorne's death, did his distress strike you as the distress of a guilty man caught, or as the distress of an innocent man asked to break a promise?" "I considered it honestly. The second, I think, though I couldn't say why." "Nor could I, precisely," Poirot admitted, and there was something in his voice I heard perhaps twice in the whole span of our long acquaintance, a note of genuine self-doubt. "And that troubles me a great deal, mon ami, because I have just sent a man to be questioned as a murderer on the strength of a theory that fits very beautifully indeed, and fits, I begin to fear, for no better reason than that I wished it to." He set down his cup, untouched, and stared into the fire for a long while without speaking. "I have made an error somewhere in this business," he said at last, very quietly. "I do not yet know where, but I begin to feel its shape, Hayes, the way one feels the shape of a stone in one's shoe, before one has troubled to remove the boot and look. The bell that told the truth." I woke the next morning to find Poirot already dressed and standing in the great hall, before the case that had once held the silver bell, though the bell itself now lay in a small box among Bramwell's collected evidence. "You did not sleep," I observed. "I did not wish to," he said. "I wish to think, and I find I think best in the small hours, when the house has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is." He gestured toward the case. "Come, look at this with me, Hayes, and tell me what you see." I looked. It seemed to me an ordinary glass case, its lock forced, its velvet lining slightly disturbed. "I see where the bell was taken from. I don't see anything beyond that." "No more did I, for 4 days," Poirot said. "And that, I think, is precisely the error. I have been asking myself who took these objects, and why, but I have not asked myself carefully enough a simpler question. When, precisely, were they taken?" He drew a small notebook from his pocket and consulted it. "The ring vanished, by Monsieur Thorne's own account, some 3 weeks past. The page from the grimoire, a fortnight past. The bell, 3 nights before his death. Each theft separated by roughly a week. And last night, the bell alone was returned. Not the ring, not the page, only the bell, and only on the very night its owner died. You think that significant? I think, Hayes, that I have been treating these 3 thefts as a single pattern, committed for a single purpose. Intimidation, I supposed, aimed at discouraging Monsieur Thorne from his inquiries into his father's death. But intimidation does not usually return what it has taken. Intimidation escalates, or it withdraws. It does not restore." He tapped the notebook against his palm. "Unless, of course, the bell was never taken for the same reason as the other two objects at all." "What other reason could there be?" "That," Poirot admitted, "is what I intend to discover, and I believe I know where to begin." He turned toward the stairs. "Fetch your coat, mon ami. I wish to speak again with Miss Cole, and this time I wish to ask her not about Monsieur Thorne's father, but about Monsieur Thorne's mother, and about a will." We found Miss Cole in the small office off the library, sorting through correspondence with the mechanical steadiness of a woman who has chosen work as the only available shelter from grief. "You mentioned," Poirot said, without preamble, "that Monsieur Thorne intended to leave you a legacy. Do you know the particulars of that legacy, mademoiselle? Was it a sum of money, or was it perhaps something more specific?" Miss Cole set down her pen slowly. "It was to be a piece from the collection. He hadn't decided which, the last time we spoke of it. He said he wanted to choose something that meant something, not simply the most valuable object, but the truest one, he called it." "The truest one," Poirot repeated softly, and I saw something move behind his eyes, the particular quickening he wore when a stray thread had suddenly found the garment it belonged to. "Mademoiselle, forgive me, but I must ask, did Monsieur Thorne, in the last weeks of his life, ever speak to you of altering his will more broadly? Not merely your own legacy, but the disposition of the estate as a whole?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the answer before she gave it. "He asked me, about 10 days ago, to write to his solicitor and request the draft of a new will. He didn't tell me what changes he intended, only that he wished it done quietly and quickly." "And did the new will arrive before his death?" "I believe the solicitor was to bring it himself, this coming week." Her composure faltered, just slightly. "You think that matters?" "I think, mademoiselle, that a man does not quietly rewrite his will unless he has learned something that changes, in his own mind, who deserves to inherit what he leaves behind." Poirot rose, and there was a new energy in his movements, the energy of a man who has stopped groping in the dark and begun, at last, to see the shape of the room around him. "Tell me one more thing. The silver bell, Monsieur Thorne called it an object that could not be bribed. Do you know why he prized it so particularly, above objects of far greater monetary value?" Miss Cole thought a moment. "He told me once, quite late at night, that his mother had given it to him. Not bought it, given it, from her own hand, when he was still a boy, before she grew too ill to give him anything at all. I always assumed Mr. Grant had sold it to him. I never thought to question it." Poirot went very still. "Mademoiselle," he said quietly, "I believe you have just told me something of very great importance, and I believe I have, until this moment, made a foolish and rather embarrassing error. Forgive me, I must speak with Inspector Bramwell at once, and I fear I must undo, rather urgently, an accusation I made in haste yesterday." We found Bramwell in the library, reviewing his notes with the stolid patience of a man who believed the case very nearly closed. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," Poirot said, "I owe you, and Monsieur Grant, an apology. I believe I sent an innocent man to your cells yesterday, on the strength of a theory that flattered my own cleverness rather more than it served the truth." Bramwell's brow furrowed. "You seemed certain enough yesterday." "I was certain," Poirot said, with a candour that plainly cost him something, "and I was wrong, which is a combination I do not enjoy admitting, but which I admit nonetheless, because a man's liberty ought never be forfeit to my vanity. Monsieur Grant kept a secret, yes, but I believe now it was not the secret of a murder. It was the secret of a mother's grief, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with why Edmund Thorne died 2 nights ago." He drew a long breath. "The true answer, I now believe, lies not 30 years in the past at all, but in a will not yet signed, and in a bell that was never stolen for its silver, but for what it proved." "Proved about what?" Poirot's eyes moved slowly toward the door, and beyond it, toward the stairs that led up to the household still sleeping, still waiting, still, one of them, guilty. "About who Edmund Thorne truly was," he said quietly, "to the person who loved him least honestly of all. The truest thing in the house." Poirot asked that the entire household be gathered once more in the drawing-room that evening, the same room in which, 4 nights before, he had first told them that a murderer walked among them. This time, however, there was no uncertainty in his bearing. He stood before the cold hearth, with his hands clasped behind him, and I recognized, in the particular brightness of his eyes, the look of a man who has at last found the last piece of a puzzle and is only waiting for the courage of others to catch up with his own. Inspector Bramwell stood near the door. Grant, released that afternoon with what grace Poirot could muster in apology, sat near the window, still pale but composed. Roland fidgeted in his chair. Miss Cole sat very still, her hands folded as always. And Mrs. Price stood, as she always stood, near the doorway to the hall, near her collection, near her house, near the family she had served for 30 years. "I owe you all an admission before I begin," Poirot said, "which is that 2 days ago I accused an innocent man of murder, because his silence fit too neatly the shape of guilt I had already built in my mind. I tell you this not to punish myself before you, though I confess I deserve some small punishment for it, but because it taught me something I had allowed myself to forget in this affair, that the shape which fits most elegantly is not always the shape which is true." He turned toward the case where the silver bell had once stood, now empty, its glass still faintly scratched from the forcing of its lock. I asked myself, at the last, a simpler question than motive or opportunity. I asked myself, why was this particular object stolen, and why was it, alone among the 3, returned? And the answer came to me only when Mademoiselle Cole told me something Monsieur Grant himself did not know he had contradicted, that Edmund Thorne believed this bell was given to him by his own mother, as a boy, long before Monsieur Grant claims to have sold it to him. Grant stirred. "I did sell it to him. I have the record of sale." "I do not doubt you sold him a bell, monsieur," Poirot said. "I doubt very much that it was the same bell his mother had given him 30 years before. I believe, in fact, that the true bell, the childhood bell, the sacred one, had been kept elsewhere in this house all along, hidden from Monsieur Thorne's own knowledge, and that what you sold him was a fine and genuine antique, but not the object his mother had once placed into his hands." "Why should anyone hide such a thing?" Roland asked, bewildered. "Because," Poirot said gently, "the true bell contained something its keeper did not wish found." He drew from his pocket a small tarnished object I had not seen before, a bell, smaller and plainer than the one displayed in Thorne's collection, its base fitted with a tiny, almost invisible seam. "I found this 2 hours ago, Inspector, in the false bottom of an old linen chest in the housekeeper's own quarters, wrapped in a girl's christening gown that I am given to understand once belonged to no child in this family at all, but was kept, I think, for sentiment's sake alone." The room had gone entirely silent. Mrs. Price did not move, but something in her face had changed. Not fear, exactly, but the stillness of a woman watching a door she had guarded for 3 decades, finally, inevitably, swing open. Poirot turned the small bell over in his hands, and from its base, with careful fingers, drew out a folded and yellowed scrap of paper. "A letter," he said quietly, "written 30 years ago, and never sent. I will not read it aloud in full, for I think its author would not wish that, and I believe her son, were he alive to ask, would not wish it either. I will say only that it is a confession, written by Edmund Thorne's mother in the days following her husband's death, and addressed to no one, kept only, I believe, as a private reckoning with her own conscience. It confirms what I now believe Mrs. Price has known, and guarded for 30 years, that the elder Monsieur Thorne did not die quietly of a seizure, but was struck, in a single moment of terror and self-defense, by the wife he had long and cruelly abused, and that Mrs. Price, discovering the truth that same night, chose to protect her mistress rather than expose her, and buried the confession, along with the truth, inside the one object she knew would never be questioned or sold. A plain child's bell, hidden ever after among linens no one thought to search. Mrs. Price's composure, held for 4 days and, I now understood, for 30 years before that, finally broke, not into weeping, but into a kind of exhausted stillness, as though a great weight had at last been set down. She was dying by inches in that marriage, she said, very quietly. I saw it happen for 11 years before that night. I do not regret what I hid, Monsieur Poirot. I would hide it again. I believe you, Poirot said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a great and weary gentleness. But Edmund Thorne, in these past weeks, came very near to finding what you had hidden. He had acquired, through Monsieur Grant, a grimoire whose missing page, now recovered, I think, from among your own possessions, described, in the fashion of such old and superstitious volumes, the practice of concealing confessions within blessed objects, that they might be found only by one worthy of the truth. It was, I believe, this very passage that set him searching in earnest for the childhood bell his mother had once told him held the truest thing in the house. He did not know what truth it held. He knew only that he was close to finding it, and he grew agitated and secretive and began asking after the manner of his father's death in a way that told you, Mrs. Price, that your 30 years of silence were nearing their end. I took the ring and the page to frighten him from it, she said, in the flat, exhausted voice of a woman past the point of further concealment. Small things. I thought if he believed some thief moved among his own collection, some danger nearer at hand than old history, he might set aside his digging and look instead to his own household safety. It did not work. It only made him more determined. And the bell itself? I took it the night before he died, meaning to destroy the letter at last, and be done with 30 years of carrying it. Her voice caught, for the first time. He found me, in the library, with the true bell open in my hands, and his mother's words spread upon the desk before me. He understood, in a single moment, everything I had spent his whole life keeping from him. He did not shout. He only looked at me as though I had stolen something far greater than silver, as though I had stolen his mother from him twice over, once in death and once again in truth. Her hands trembled now, at last, after 4 days of stillness. I did not mean to strike him. I meant only to stop him reaching for the letter, to keep it from him even then, even in that last moment, and my hand found the key upon the desk, and I did not think, Monsieur Poirot. I have thought of nothing else since. And the returned bell? Poirot asked, very softly. The one from the collection, placed beside his body. I could not bear for the true one to be found beside him, she whispered. I put back the one he had bought from Mr. Grant, not knowing you would see the difference, hoping only that some part of the shape would look correct, and that in my grief I might be permitted the small mercy of confusion. No one spoke for a long moment. Bramwell, to his credit, allowed the silence its full weight before stepping forward to do the duty his office required of him. It was very late that night, long after Mrs. Price had been led away and the house had settled into the particular hush that follows a truth finally spoken, that Poirot and I sat once more before the library fire, the last night, as it turned out, that either of us would spend beneath that roof. A collection worth dying for, I said, half to myself, remembering the words with which Thorne's story had first been described to us, and a truth worth killing to protect. Both true, Poirot said, and neither, I think, quite as separate as they first appeared. Monsieur Thorne collected midnight things all his life, Hayes, because he sensed, I believe, some shadow at the edge of his own history that he could never quite name. He did not know he was collecting his way toward his mother's grave, one strange and beautiful object at a time, until at last he held the truest one of all in his hands, and it killed him before he could fully understand what he had found. And Mrs. Price? A woman who loved too well, and silently, for 30 years, and mistook the keeping of a secret for the keeping of a promise, until the promise outlived its purpose, and became instead a kind of prison, both for herself and, in the end, for the very man she meant to protect. Poirot shook his head slowly, watching the fire. It is the oldest error there is, mon ami. We convince ourselves that silence is kindness, and we do not notice, until it is far too late, that we have simply been protecting ourselves from the discomfort of the truth, and calling it love. Outside, the fog had at last begun to lift from the grounds of Ravenscombe Hall, and through the tall windows I could see, for the first time since our arrival, the pale beginning of stars. Some collections, Poirot said quietly, rising at last to bid the fire and the house good night, are indeed worth dying for, Hayes, but I think, when all is said, that none are worth what this house has lost in keeping them.